New kid faces bullies. They never saw this coming. The quiet boy who refused to break becomes unstoppable. What would you do if you were pushed around every day, treated like you didn't belong? What if the ones who tormented you thought you were weak, only to realize they had just made the worst mistake of their lives? This is the story of Marcus Johnson, a quiet newcomer at Westfield High who became the unexpected target of Ethan Walker, the so-called king of the school. Ethan had ruled through fear, deciding who was respected and who was nothing. And when Marcus arrived, Ethan thought he had found his next victim. But Marcus was not like the others. The insults, the shoves, the cruel tricks, none of it made him flinch. He refused to play by Ethan's rules. And when the bullying escalated, when they thought they had him cornered, Marcus finally fought back. What happened next would leave the entire school in shock. This isn't just a story about standing up to a bully. It's about strength, patience, and knowing when to act. It's about the moment the balance of power shifted, and the lesson Ethan Walker would never forget. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories like this. Marcus never wanted to leave his old town. It was home, the place where he knew every street, every neighbor, every hidden shortcut through the park. But when his mother got a new job offer, one that promised better pay and more stability, there was no choice. They packed up their lives, loaded everything into a U-Haul, and drove nearly 800 miles to a small town called Westfield. The moment they arrived, Marcus felt it, the quiet, the way people glanced at them through their windows as they pulled into their new driveway. His mother, always optimistic, smiled and said, "Give it time, sweetheart. New places take some getting used to." But Marcus knew. This town was different. It wasn't just that everything looked unfamiliar, the tree-lined streets, the neatly trimmed lawns, the perfectly spaced mailboxes, it was that the people looked unfamiliar too. The first time they went grocery shopping, Marcus noticed how people seemed polite, but distant. Cashiers greeted them with forced smiles, and shoppers glanced at them just a second too long before turning away. His mother, busy reading labels and checking prices, didn't seem to notice. But Marcus did. He could feel it in his gut. They weren't just new here. They were different. And in a town like Westfield, that mattered. On his first morning at Westfield High, Marcus stepped through the front doors and immediately felt every eye in the hallway land on him. It wasn't just a quick glance, the kind people give when they notice someone new. It was longer, heavier, like they were trying to figure out what he was doing there. He walked past rows of blue lockers, his footsteps echoing on the polished floors. Groups of students stood huddled together, talking and laughing, but their conversations slowed when he passed. Some whispered, some just stared. No one said hello. Marcus wasn't new to being the only black kid in a room, but this was different. The walls were lined with photos of past graduating classes, all filled with the same familiar faces, white, smiling, and untouched by time. He wondered if any of them had ever looked like him. In his first class, the teacher paused for a second too long before reading his name from the attendance sheet. "Marcus Johnson," she said, her voice careful, like she didn't want to get it wrong. A few students turned to get a better look at him. Marcus kept his head down, gripping his pencil a little tighter. He already knew, this wasn't just about being new. Here, he would always stand out. Marcus had been at Westfield High for less than an hour, but he already knew, he wasn't just the new kid. He was the new kid. The one everyone noticed. The one no one knew what to do with. In the hallway between classes, students didn't just glance at him, they stared. Some tried to be subtle, peeking at him from the corners of their eyes. Others didn't bother hiding it at all, turning their heads to watch as he walked by. He could hear the whispers, feel the weight of their curiosity pressing down on him like a thick, invisible fog. At lunch, he carried his tray through the cafeteria, scanning the room for an empty seat. Most tables were filled with familiar groups, football players laughing loudly, cheerleaders flipping their hair, kids with their heads buried in textbooks. But as he walked past, conversations paused. People nudged their friends and nodded in his direction, whispering just low enough that he couldn't make out the words, but he knew what they were saying. He finally found an empty table in the far corner, sat down, and kept his head down, eating in silence. He wasn't expecting a warm welcome, but he hadn't expected this either. This wasn't just the awkwardness of being new. This was different. No one had been rude, no one had said anything wrong, but he could feel it. He didn't belong. And in a school like Westfield, that mattered. Ethan Walker had ruled Westfield High for as long as anyone could remember. He wasn't just popular, he was the kind of kid everyone either wanted to be or wanted to be on the good side of. His father was the school's football coach, and that alone gave him a level of power most kids could never dream of. Teachers gave him the benefit of the doubt. Students followed his lead. If Ethan liked you, life at Westfield was easy. If he didn't, it was hell. The moment he spotted Marcus in the hallway, he knew. New kid. Alone. Quiet. Different. That was all it took. Ethan leaned against his locker, arms crossed, watching as Marcus walked past. He could already hear the whispers circling the school, questions about where Marcus came from, whether he played sports, why he didn't talk to anyone. Ethan smirked. It didn't matter who Marcus was before he got here. What mattered was who he would be now. And Ethan had already decided Marcus would be his next target. It started small, like it always did. A bump in the hallway that sent Marcus's books spilling to the floor. A sarcastic comment thrown his way in class, loud enough for everyone to hear, but quiet enough that the teacher ignored it. A lunch tray accidentally knocked off a table. Nothing big, just enough to make sure Marcus understood his place. But the thing that got under Ethan's skin the most? Marcus didn't react. No anger, no fear. Just calm. And that made Ethan more determined than ever to break him. Because no one ignored Ethan Walker. No one. Ethan Walker had never had to earn respect. It was handed to him the moment he stepped foot into Westfield High. His father, Coach Walker, wasn't just the football coach, he was a legend in town. For years, he had led the school's team to championship after championship, and that kind of success made people overlook a lot of things. Teachers smiled a little wider when Ethan walked into the room. Parents of other students treated him like he was already somebody important. At school, Ethan's last name carried weight. He could skip assignments, show up late, or mouth off to a teacher, and the worst he'd get was a warning. If anyone else tried that, they'd get detention. Maybe worse. But Ethan? He was untouchable. The other students saw it too. Nobody wanted to cross him, not the athletes who looked up to him, not the kids who wanted to stay out of trouble, and definitely not the ones who had already been on the receiving end of his games. With that kind of power, Ethan didn't just get what he wanted, he decided who mattered. Who sat at the best lunch tables. Who walked down the hallway with their head high and who had to keep their eyes on the floor. And now, with Marcus stepping into his world, Ethan had already made up his mind. Marcus wasn't going to be an exception. He was going to be an example. At Westfield High, Ethan Walker didn't need to throw punches to be feared. He had mastered a different kind of power, the kind that came with control. He decided who was in and who was out, who was respected and who was ignored. His approval could make someone's life easy, but his disapproval? That could turn someone's high school years into a slow-moving nightmare. He didn't act alone. His group, Tyler, Brandon, Cole, and Jake, moved through the halls like a pack, always nearby, always watching. They didn't have to say much, most people already knew the rules. Stay in your place. Laugh at Ethan's jokes, even if they were at your expense. Never challenge him, not even in small ways. Those who did often found themselves at the center of some cruel joke, a rumor spreading through the school, a locker mysteriously jammed shut, a humiliating post on social media that made its rounds before the teachers could even catch on. For Ethan, it wasn't about the fight, it was about making sure there wasn't one. He didn't want resistance, he wanted obedience. and if someone refused to play along, he knew exactly how to break them down, piece by piece. That's why Marcus bothered him. He wasn't scared, wasn't impressed, wasn't falling in line. And for the first time, Ethan felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty. It started small, the way it always did. Ethan didn't go straight for the knockout. He preferred to toy with his targets first, to see how much they could take before they cracked. With Marcus, it was no different. The first shove came in the hallway between classes. Nothing obvious, just a quick bump to the shoulder as Ethan passed by, knocking Marcus off balance. "Watch where you're going," Ethan said with a smirk, his friends chuckling beside him. Marcus didn't react, just adjusted his backpack and kept walking. Next came the cafeteria. As Marcus carried his lunch tray to an empty table, Tyler accidentally swung his backpack just wide enough to catch the edge of Marcus's tray, sending his food splattering onto the floor. "Oops," Tyler said, not even bothering to hide his grin. The students nearby snickered, waiting for Marcus to get angry. He didn't. He just sighed, picked up his tray, and walked away. The whispers followed him down the hallways. "Where's he from? Why doesn't he talk to anyone? Thinks he's better than us?" Ethan's gang spread the rumors effortlessly, planting the seeds that would make Marcus's isolation feel even heavier. But no matter what they did, Marcus never flinched. He never fought back, never lashed out. And that's what bothered Ethan the most. He wanted Marcus to react. He wanted to see fear. But all he got was silence, and that only made him push harder. Ethan was used to a certain reaction. Fear. Anger. Embarrassment. That's how it always worked. A few well-placed insults, a couple of shoves, and people learned their place. They flinched. They got nervous when he walked by. They avoided eye contact. But Marcus? He didn't play along. No matter what Ethan and his gang threw at him, Marcus never showed any sign that it bothered him. When they knocked his books to the floor, he picked them up without a word. When they made jokes at his expense, he didn't argue back, didn't even roll his eyes, he just acted like they weren't worth his time. And somehow, that was worse than anything else. Ethan could feel the control slipping through his fingers, and it made his blood boil. The whole school was watching. They might not have been saying it out loud, but Ethan could tell. People were waiting to see if he could actually get to Marcus. And if he couldn't? If Marcus just kept walking through the halls like Ethan didn't exist? That would be the real humiliation. Ethan clenched his fists, forcing a smirk in front of his friends. "Don't worry," he muttered under his breath as Marcus walked past them, completely unfazed. "We'll see how long he lasts." Because in Ethan's world, nobody ignored him. And if Marcus wasn't scared yet, Ethan would just have to push harder. Ethan wasn't the kind of person to let things go. If something didn't work the first time, he just pushed harder. And with Marcus, that's exactly what he planned to do. The harmless accidents turned into something more deliberate. Walking through the crowded hallway, Marcus would suddenly find himself shoved harder than before, his shoulders slamming into a locker, his books nearly slipping from his grip. "My bad," Ethan would say, grinning, while the other students looked on but said nothing. In the cafeteria, the incidents became more obvious. One afternoon, as Marcus carried his tray, Brandon accidentally stuck out his foot. Marcus tripped slightly, catching himself just in time. But before he could react, Cole reached over and knocked the tray right out of his hands. Food splattered across the floor. Laughter followed. Marcus looked at them, not with fear or anger, but with that same quiet stare, calm, unreadable. And then, without a word, he bent down, picked up what he could, and walked away. That silence, that refusal to acknowledge their power, made Ethan furious. The next morning, when Marcus opened his locker, a wave of water poured out, soaking his books and papers. Tyler leaned against the wall nearby, whistling, pretending he hadn't seen anything. Marcus clenched his jaw but didn't react. He just grabbed what he could, shook off the excess water, and walked to class. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Ethan's games always worked. People always reacted. But Marcus? He was making it look easy. And that meant Ethan had to take things even further. Ethan's group wasn't satisfied with just shoving Marcus in the halls or knocking over his lunch tray. When he refused to react, they took things further. His backpack became a target. One afternoon, while he was in gym class, someone dumped an open soda inside it. When he pulled out his textbooks, the pages were sticky, the ink bleeding into unreadable smudges. The snickering from the back of the room told him exactly who was responsible. Marcus exhaled slowly, shook the excess liquid from the ruined pages, and set the book aside. He didn't say a word. His locker wasn't safe either. Every few days, he'd find it jammed shut, forcing him to ask a teacher for help. Other times, it was left wide open, his things scattered across the floor. But it wasn't just his belongings, they wanted to break him down piece by piece. The insults started small, just a few muttered words as he walked past. Lost, city boy? Don't they have schools where you're from? Loud enough for him to hear, soft enough that no teacher ever caught it. Students who might have spoken to him before now avoided him. Not because they had anything against him, but because no one wanted to be next. If you sat near Marcus, if you so much as acknowledged him, you became a target too. Marcus saw it happening. The way people turned away in the hallways, the way an empty chair would stay empty next to him in class. But he never begged for acceptance. Never lashed out. He carried on like none of it mattered. And that was what made Ethan's crew even angrier. Because to them, it did matter. And they wouldn't stop until Marcus felt it too. At first, the whispers were quiet, just background noise in the crowded hallways of Westfield High. But like a match dropped into dry grass, they spread fast. Ethan's group made sure of that. I heard he got kicked out of his last school, someone muttered near the lockers. My cousin says he was in a gang back in the city, another voice chimed in. Did you see how he never talks to anyone? Probably hiding something. None of it was true, but that didn't matter. People loved a good story, and when there wasn't one, they created their own. Ethan and his friends knew exactly how to feed it, just enough truth to make the lies feel real. They'd throw in a comment here, a smirk there, then step back and let the rumors take on a life of their own. By the end of the week, Marcus wasn't just the new kid anymore. He was a mystery, a threat, an outsider who didn't belong. Teachers might not have paid attention, but students did. Some started avoiding him altogether, stepping out of his way in the halls, lowering their voices when he passed. It wasn't fear, it was uncertainty. People didn't know what to make of him, and that alone was enough to turn them against him. Marcus heard the rumors, of course. He saw the way kids whispered behind cupped hands, how they looked at him with something different in their eyes now, hesitation, suspicion. But, like everything else, he didn't react. He just kept walking, kept moving forward. And that, more than anything, made Ethan furious. Ethan had seen it happen 100 times before. A shove in the hallway, a cruel joke in the cafeteria, a rumor whispered just loud enough to be heard. Eventually, people cracked. They lashed out, they yelled, they tried to fight back. And that's when Ethan really won. Because anger made people sloppy. Fear made them weak. Once they reacted, they had already lost. But Marcus didn't crack. Day after day, Ethan and his crew pushed him, harder, meaner, louder. Yet, no matter what they did, Marcus never gave them what they wanted. He never yelled, never fought, never even rolled his eyes in frustration. He simply took a slow breath and kept moving, like none of it mattered. And that made Ethan furious. One afternoon, as Marcus sat alone in the cafeteria, Brandon casually walked by and knocked his drink over, spilling soda all over his tray. A few kids laughed, waiting for Marcus to snap. But instead, he just picked up his tray, wiped off his hands, and threw it away like nothing had happened. Ethan clenched his jaw, his fists tightening. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be in control. But every time Marcus refused to react, it felt like he was the one losing. That night, Ethan sat in his room, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in his head. Marcus wasn't fighting back, but he wasn't backing down either. And Ethan knew, without a doubt, that he couldn't let it go. He had to make Marcus react, no matter what it took. The sun had already dipped below the horizon by the time Marcus left the school library, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his breath visible in the cool evening air. The campus was nearly empty now, just the sound of the flagpole ropes clanking softly in the breeze, the occasional car pulling out of the parking lot. He didn't hear them at first. The footsteps were careful, deliberate. Then, just as he reached the back path leading toward the main road, he felt it, the unmistakable sense of being watched. He stopped. Behind him, a slow shuffle of feet. A low chuckle. Marcus turned and saw them. Ethan stood in the center, hands in his pockets, a smirk curling his lips. Brandon, Cole, and Tyler flanked him like shadows, their postures loose but ready. "Where you headed, Johnson?" Ethan's voice was casual, too casual. "We figured you could use some company." Marcus didn't respond. He just looked at them, measuring. 4 against 1. That was how it always worked with guys like Ethan. "See, we've been real patient," Ethan continued, stepping closer. "Tried to be nice, give you a chance to learn how things work around here. But you just keep acting like you're better than everybody." Tyler cracked his knuckles. "Yeah, and that's a problem." Marcus didn't move, didn't speak. Ethan tilted his head, eyes narrowing. He wanted to see something: fear, anger, hesitation. Anything. Instead, Marcus exhaled slowly and dropped his backpack to the ground. For the first time since he had arrived at Westfield High, he wasn't walking away. Ethan had been waiting for this moment. He had pushed, and now, finally, Marcus had nowhere to go. No teachers. No crowd. Just them, standing in the dim glow of the parking lot lights. He expected the same thing he always got when someone realized they were trapped: fear. The nervous glance around for an escape. The shallow breathing. The stammered excuse, the weak attempt at backing down. That was how it always played out. But Marcus didn't look afraid. He didn't step back. He didn't break eye contact. He didn't do anything they expected. Ethan's smirk faltered for half a second before he covered it up with a scoff. "What's the matter, Johnson? Cat got your tongue?" He took a step closer, testing. Still nothing. Brandon laughed, shaking his head. "Man, he's frozen." But he wasn't. Marcus wasn't frozen, he was waiting. The gang exchanged quick glances, suddenly unsure. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Marcus was supposed to panic. Maybe plead. Maybe run. But not this. Not this eerie, steady calm. Tyler, the biggest of them, shoved forward, eager to break the tension. "Guess we're just gonna have to make this real simple for you." He swung, expecting an easy hit. And in that moment, Ethan saw it, just for a flash, something sharp, something controlled in Marcus's expression. Then everything changed. Tyler swung hard, expecting to land a clean hit, expecting Marcus to stumble, to backpedal, to finally show some fear. But Marcus wasn't there. In the blink of an eye, he sidestepped, smooth and precise, letting Tyler's punch cut through nothing but air. The momentum sent Tyler off balance, his body twisting slightly as he tried to recover. But Marcus didn't give him the chance. With a quick, practiced motion, Marcus grabbed Tyler's wrist, twisted it sharply, and stepped in close. Tyler barely had time to register what was happening before his own weight was being used against him. His feet left the ground, and then, bam, his back slammed hard against the pavement. The sound of his body hitting the ground echoed in the still night air. For a long, stretched-out second, no one moved. No one spoke. Ethan's smirk was gone. Brandon and Cole exchanged wide-eyed glances. This wasn't a lucky hit. This wasn't some desperate, last-minute swing. This was something else, something dangerous. Tyler groaned, clutching his wrist, his breath coming in short, pained bursts. He wasn't getting back up anytime soon. Marcus stood over him, his breathing steady, his expression unreadable. It was like he had just set down a book instead of throwing a man twice his size onto the ground. Ethan's fingers curled into fists. This wasn't supposed to happen. Marcus was supposed to lose. But for the first time since this all started, Ethan felt something unexpected creeping in. Doubt. Tyler groaned on the pavement, still gripping his wrist, his chest rising and falling in short, labored breaths. The rest of the gang just stood there, frozen, their confidence slipping like sand through their fingers. Marcus didn't move toward them. He didn't need to. The way he had taken Tyler down, so fast, so effortlessly, was enough to change the air around them. Brandon took a half step back before catching himself. Cole clenched his jaw, shifting nervously. Ethan, for the first time in his life, wasn't sure what to do. Because Marcus wasn't just some kid who got lucky in a fight. He wasn't some quiet outsider they could push around until he broke. He was trained. They could see it now, in the way he stood, calm, controlled, balanced. Not tense. Not on edge. Just ready. Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. Fights at Westfield High were sloppy, full of wild punches and big, clumsy movements. But this was something else entirely. Marcus had barely done anything, and yet Tyler was on the ground, already beaten. It didn't make sense. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. Then Marcus did something that made Ethan's stomach twist. He slowly, deliberately, tilted his head. Not in challenge. Not in anger. Just watching. As if waiting to see who would be stupid enough to make the next move. By the next morning, the whole school was buzzing. No one had seen the fight, but everyone had heard about it. It spread like wildfire, slipping through the hallways, whispered between classes, passed from locker to locker. The details changed depending on who was telling it, but the message stayed the same: Marcus Johnson wasn't just some new kid. He was dangerous. I heard he took down Tyler with one move. No way. I heard he took down all of them. My brother said Marcus was a trained fighter, like MMA or something. I heard he broke Tyler's arm. Some kids laughed it off, shaking their heads. Nah, that's just a rumor. But even the skeptics spoke a little softer when Marcus walked by. Even the ones who didn't believe the story still felt something had shifted. Because the unspoken rules of Westfield High were clear, Ethan Walker was in charge. Ethan's crew never lost. But now one of them had been left on the pavement, groaning, humiliated. And it wasn't by another football player. It wasn't by some tough guy trying to prove a point. It was Marcus. The quiet kid. The outsider. And that was what made it scary. Ethan was still walking through the halls like nothing had changed, still smirking, still laughing too loud. But people weren't looking at him the same way. Now, when he passed, heads turned, not to admire him, but to watch how he reacted. Because for the first time, Ethan wasn't the one setting the rules. He was the one trying to keep up. By lunchtime, the rumors had taken on a life of their own. What had started as whispers about the fight had twisted into something bigger, something unstoppable. Marcus isn't just some regular kid, he's got combat training. I heard his dad was in the military and taught him how to fight. No, he was kicked out of his last school for almost putting a kid in the hospital. I heard he used to fight in underground matches. You know, like illegal stuff. The stories spread fast, morphing each time they were retold. Some swore Marcus had a violent past, that he had been forced to transfer to Westfield because his old school couldn't handle him. Others whispered about secret training, saying he had been taught by professionals, that he knew moves no normal high schooler should know. None of it was true. Marcus had never been in a fight before Westfield. His father had trained him, not for violence, but for discipline. For control. But the truth didn't matter anymore. The idea of Marcus had become bigger than the actual person. Some students looked at him with quiet admiration, impressed by the idea of someone strong enough to stand against Ethan. Others kept their distance, unsure of what to believe. And then there were the ones who saw him as a threat. Ethan watched it all happen, his jaw clenched tighter with every passing hour. He had spent years controlling the way people thought, shaping the school's social order like a game he had already won. But now, for the first time, he was the one people were whispering about. And he couldn't stand it. Ethan had never worried about control before. It was something he had always had, effortlessly, naturally. People listened to him. They followed his lead. He didn't have to demand respect because it was already his. But now, something was different. Walking through the halls, he could feel it, something off in the way people looked at him. They weren't nodding at him like before, not laughing as easily at his jokes. When he walked into the cafeteria, heads still turned, but it wasn't admiration or fear in their eyes anymore. It was curiosity. They were waiting. Watching. He heard the whispers before he even sat down. "Did you hear what happened with Marcus? They say Ethan's crew tried to mess with him, and he took them down. I mean, they won't say anything, but you notice how quiet they've been." Ethan's jaw clenched. He looked over at his usual group, Brandon, Cole, Tyler. They were there, but they weren't acting like themselves. Tyler, still sore from his fall, wasn't bragging about the fight. Brandon and Cole weren't making jokes about Marcus the way they should have been. They were just sitting there, eating in silence. And the worst part? Marcus wasn't even trying to take his place. He wasn't laughing about what had happened. He wasn't spreading rumors of his own. He was just existing, calm, steady, completely unfazed. And somehow, that was enough to make Ethan feel like he was slipping. For the first time, he realized he had never been in a fight he couldn't win. Until now. Ethan couldn't let this stand. He had spent years building his reputation, making sure everyone at Westfield High knew exactly who was in charge. And now people were whispering about Marcus instead of him. That had to change. If he couldn't erase what had happened, he could at least rewrite the story. By the next day, Ethan had started planting the idea wherever he could. He didn't say much, just a few words here, a casual comment there. He knew how rumors worked. You didn't need to force them. You just needed to suggest something, and people would run with it. He got lucky, that's all. Yeah, he dodged one punch, big deal. If it was a real fight, he wouldn't stand a chance. I mean, think about it, if he's so tough, why hasn't he stepped up? Why won't he fight Ethan for real? The seed was planted. Now, he just had to wait. By lunch, the rumor had already spread. The same students who had been whispering about how strong Marcus was were now questioning him. Yeah, I guess he did just take down Tyler, not Ethan. Maybe he's just one of those guys who runs from a real fight. You think Ethan's right? Maybe Marcus is scared. Ethan sat back, watching it unfold, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. It didn't matter what actually happened. What mattered was what people believed. And soon, Marcus would have no choice but to prove himself on Ethan's terms. By the time Friday afternoon rolled around, the schoolyard was buzzing with energy. It wasn't just another day. Everyone knew something was coming. Ethan made sure of it. He stood in the center of the courtyard, his usual smirk plastered on his face, his arms crossed like he had already won. His crew flanked him, trying to look confident, but there was an edge to them now, an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Marcus was nearby, leaning casually against a tree, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He wasn't hiding, wasn't avoiding anything. That's what made Ethan even angrier. "Hey, Johnson." Ethan's voice cut through the chatter, loud enough to turn every head in the yard. Marcus didn't react right away. He took his time, slowly lifting his gaze, calm as ever. "You've been real quiet lately," Ethan continued, stepping forward. Thought maybe you'd want to settle this. You know, like men. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. They'd all heard the rumors, how Marcus had supposedly dodged a real fight, how he was all defense and no offense. Ethan spread his arms. Unless, of course, you're scared. Marcus met Ethan's eyes, and, for a moment, there was nothing but silence. The kind that made your chest tighten, that made people lean in, waiting for something to explode. And then, finally, Marcus spoke. His voice was low, steady. And what he said changed everything. The moment Ethan threw out his challenge, the entire schoolyard seemed to hold its breath. Students who had been scattered across the grass, sitting on benches, or chatting by the lockers all turned their attention toward Marcus. Conversations died. Lunches were forgotten. Even the kids who usually avoided trouble couldn't help but stop and stare. This was it. The moment they had all been waiting for. Everyone expected Marcus to fight. Had to fight. That's how things worked at Westfield High. If Ethan called you out, you either backed down and became a nobody, or you stepped up and proved yourself. There was no in-between. Whispers moved through the crowd like wildfire. He has to accept, right? I mean, what's he gonna do, just stand there? If he walks away, it means Ethan was right all along. Even some of the teachers watched from a distance, pretending they weren't paying attention. No one was going to stop this. Ethan shifted his weight, smirking like he had already won. Come on, Johnson, he taunted, his voice dripping with confidence. We both know you can't hide forever. All eyes turned to Marcus, waiting. Expecting him to step forward. Expecting him to throw a punch. Expecting him to play the game. But Marcus didn't move. He didn't take a fighting stance. Instead, he just looked at Ethan, calm, unreadable. Then, at last, he spoke. And what he said made Ethan's stomach drop. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Ethan stood there, his smirk frozen in place, waiting for Marcus to step forward, waiting for the fight to begin. The crowd was leaning in, ready for fists to fly. But instead, Marcus just exhaled slowly, shook his head, and spoke. I don't fight people weaker than me. The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. They cut through the air like a blade, sinking into every ear, every mind. A ripple of stunned silence spread through the crowd. Ethan blinked. What? His voice cracked slightly, just enough that a few kids exchanged glances. Marcus didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. He just stood there, completely at ease, his hands resting at his sides. The meaning was clear. Ethan wasn't a challenge. He wasn't even worth the effort. A few hushed murmurs started among the students. Then a low chuckle. Then, before Ethan could even process what had happened, laughter. Not from Marcus, but from the crowd. Ethan's face burned hot. His fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to swing, to wipe that look off Marcus's face. But he couldn't. Because in that moment, without throwing a single punch, Marcus had done the one thing Ethan never thought possible. He had beaten him. For a moment, there was only silence. A deep, stretching quiet where it seemed like even the wind had stopped moving. Then, the first laugh broke through. It was small at first, just a chuckle from somewhere in the crowd. Then another. And another. And suddenly, the schoolyard erupted. Laughter rippled through the students like a wave, some trying to muffle it, others letting it burst out in full. It wasn't just about what Marcus had said, it was about who he had said it to. Ethan Walker, the self-proclaimed king of Westfield High, had just been dismissed like he didn't even matter. Ethan's face turned red, his jaw tightening as he looked around. He saw it all, Brandon shifting uncomfortably, Tyler looking down, Cole rubbing the back of his neck. His own crew wasn't backing him up. They weren't laughing with him. They were just watching. And the rest of the school? They were enjoying every second of it. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to hit Marcus, to make him pay. But deep down, he knew swinging now wouldn't fix anything. It would only make it worse. Marcus hadn't humiliated him with a punch. He had done something much worse. He had made Ethan irrelevant. Ethan felt the heat rise up his neck, his pulse pounding in his ears. The laughter was still ringing out around him, but all he could focus on was Marcus. The calm expression. The steady eyes. The way he just stood there, completely unshaken, like Ethan wasn't even a threat. Ethan's hands curled into fists. He wasn't going to let this happen. Without thinking, without planning, without any of the confidence he usually carried, Ethan lunged forward. His fist cut through the air, a wild, angry swing aimed straight at Marcus's face. It wasn't controlled, it wasn't calculated, it was pure rage, the kind that blinds a man before he even realizes what he's done. The crowd gasped. Everything seemed to slow for just a second. But before Ethan's punch could land, before he could even register what was happening, Marcus moved. Not in panic. Not in fear. Just a smooth, effortless shift, a breath before impact. Ethan's fist sliced through empty space. His own momentum betrayed him, sending him stumbling forward, his balance thrown completely off. And in that split second, before he could recover, before he could even comprehend what had gone wrong, he realized something. He had already lost. Ethan's fist sliced through nothing but air. He had swung with everything he had, expecting impact, expecting satisfaction. But Marcus wasn't there. The moment Ethan lunged, Marcus had already shifted, smooth, effortless, like he had seen it coming before Ethan even made his move. Ethan's body lurched forward, his momentum carrying him too far. His foot caught awkwardly on the pavement, and suddenly, he was stumbling, his arms flailing, his balance completely gone. The crowd gasped. It was subtle, almost too quick to register, but it was obvious. Marcus hadn't even touched him. He hadn't countered, hadn't blocked, hadn't needed to. Ethan had beaten himself. For a split second, everything was still. Then, snickers started breaking out from the students watching. Someone let out a low whistle. Ethan clenched his jaw, his face burning. He knew exactly what they were thinking. He missed. He lost control. He looked ridiculous. He whirled back toward Marcus, fists still tight at his sides. But Marcus didn't look smug. He didn't gloat. He just stood there, watching, unshaken, unbothered. Like Ethan wasn't even worth the fight. Ethan tried to catch himself, but it was too late. His feet tangled beneath him, his arms flailed for balance, but the momentum had already won. With a heavy thud, he hit the ground. Flat on his chest. In front of everyone. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the laughter erupted. It started with a few snickers, muffled at first, like people were trying to hold it back. But they couldn't. It spread, growing louder, until the entire schoolyard was shaking with it. Ethan, the king of Westfield High, the guy who always won, was lying on the pavement like a fool. He could feel it, heat crawling up his neck, the burn of humiliation hotter than the scrape on his palms. He didn't even need to look up to know what was happening. Brandon and Cole were frozen, unsure whether to help him up or pretend they didn't know him. The crowd was eating it up, some pointing, some whispering. And Marcus? Marcus hadn't moved. Hadn't laughed. Hadn't gloated. He was just there, calm as ever, watching Ethan struggle to pick himself up. And somehow, that made it even worse. Ethan had lost. Not in a fight. Not with bruises or blood. But in the only way that mattered. In front of everyone. The laughter rolled through the schoolyard like a wave, growing louder with every second. It wasn't just a few kids anymore, it was everyone. Some clutched their sides, gasping between fits of laughter. Others slapped their friends on the back, shaking their heads in disbelief. Even the ones who usually stayed out of trouble couldn't hold it in. Ethan Walker, the guy who had ruled Westfield High, who had made others feel small, was the one on the ground now. And nobody was looking at him with fear or respect anymore. They were laughing at him. Brandon and Cole stood stiffly nearby, their eyes darting between Ethan and the crowd, unsure whether to help him up or pretend they hadn't seen anything. Even Tyler, still sore from his earlier takedown, kept his head down, not daring to meet Ethan's glare. Ethan scrambled to his feet, his face burning red. He wanted to yell, to shut them up, to do something to take back control. But what could he say? What could he do? Marcus hadn't even fought him. Hadn't even tried. And that's what made it worse. Because Ethan's reputation wasn't just damaged. It was gone. Ethan had never felt powerless before. His whole life, people had listened when he spoke, moved when he commanded, and feared what would happen if they didn't. But after that moment in the schoolyard, after the laughter, after the humiliation, he felt something he had never known before. Defeat. He couldn't let it end like that. For days, he avoided the hallways where the whispers were loudest, ignored the way people glanced at him before quickly looking away. His name, once spoken with admiration and respect, was now just another part of the latest joke. But he had a plan. This wouldn't be another public embarrassment. He wasn't going to give Marcus the chance to dodge, to humiliate him without even lifting a finger. No, this time, Ethan would stack the odds so high that there wouldn't be a chance for Marcus to win. That's when he started making calls. The first was to Jason King, the wrestling team's captain. A senior. Built like a brick wall, with arms that looked like they could snap a man in half. Jason didn't care about school drama, but when Ethan told him that Marcus had been running his mouth, claiming he could take down anyone, Jason smirked. I'd love to see him try. Next was Derek Lane, one of the hardest hitters on the football team. Known for playing dirty, Derek had been suspended twice for on-field fights. He didn't need much convincing. So you need me to teach this kid a lesson? He asked, already cracking his knuckles. I'm in. Then there was Zach Torres, the quiet one. He didn't fight often, but when he did, people stayed down. Ethan didn't know much about him, but he knew this: Zach didn't care about winning or losing. He just liked to hurt people. By the time he was done, Ethan had a crew that was stronger, meaner, and more experienced than his usual lackeys. This wasn't going to be a childish schoolyard fight. It was going to be a message. And when it was over, Marcus wouldn't be standing anymore. Ethan knew that if he wanted his plan to work, he couldn't just ask for help. He had to sell it. Guys like Jason, Derek, and Zach didn't get involved in fights over high school drama. They didn't care about Ethan's bruised ego. If he came to them whining about how Marcus had embarrassed him, they'd laugh in his face. So he told them a different story. A better story. I don't know what's up with this guy, Ethan said casually, leaning against the locker in the weight room. But he's been running his mouth about your teams. Jason King raised an eyebrow. What are you talking about? Ethan shrugged. You know how quiet guys are. They don't say much, but when they do talk, it's because they really mean it. I heard Marcus telling some people in the cafeteria that wrestling is just fake toughness. Said any real fighter wouldn't waste their time rolling around on a mat. Jason's expression darkened. He had spent years perfecting his craft, winning matches, cutting weight, and pushing through grueling workouts. And now some kid who had never stepped on the mat was calling it fake. Yeah, Ethan continued, seeing the hook set. And apparently, he said something about the football team too. Derek leaned forward. What did he say? Ethan sighed, shaking his head like he hated to even repeat it. That football players are just big guys with no real skill. That anyone can be a good player as long as they lift weights and run fast. Derek scowled. He said that? Yep, Ethan nodded. Right to a couple of freshmen. Guess he thinks he's better than everyone. Jason cracked his knuckles. That cocky little. Ethan lifted his hands, playing the part of the reasonable guy. Look, I don't care what he says about me. But the way I see it, If some outsider is gonna talk trash about our school, about our teams, then maybe he needs to learn a lesson. Derek glanced at Zach, who remained quiet but smirked slightly. When's this happening? Ethan felt a slow grin spread across his face. Friday. Behind the school. 5 o'clock. And just like that, the trap was set. Ethan had spent the last few days setting everything in motion. The rumors had spread, the anger had been stirred, and the right people had been recruited. Now, all that was left was making sure Marcus had nowhere to run. This wasn't going to be some hallway confrontation or a cafeteria shove. This was going to be a full-on takedown, something no one would forget. And for that to happen, Marcus had to show up. Ethan knew Marcus wasn't the type to be baited by loud threats or childish taunts. He was too controlled for that. So, Ethan went with something simpler, something direct. A challenge. Halfway through the school day, Marcus found a note on his desk. It wasn't passed secretly, wasn't slipped under his books when no one was looking. It had been placed there, boldly, publicly. Marcus picked it up, unfolded the paper, and read the message scrawled in Ethan's sharp, familiar handwriting. Behind the school. 5 p.m. Show up or prove you'll just talk. No threats. No insults. Just a statement, one that Marcus knew the whole school would hear about before the final bell rang. And sure enough, by the next period, the whispers had started. You think he'll show? I mean, if he doesn't, it kinda proves Ethan right. What if he actually takes Ethan down again? Ethan leaned against his locker, grinning as he listened to the chatter. His plan was working perfectly. He wasn't just setting up a fight, he was making sure Marcus had no choice but to be there. The pressure built throughout the day. People eyed Marcus in the halls, waiting for some kind of reaction. But, as always, Marcus stayed unreadable. He didn't crumple the note. Didn't scoff. Didn't even acknowledge that people were talking. He simply folded the paper neatly, tucked it into his pocket, and walked to his next class like nothing had changed. That irritated Ethan more than he cared to admit. But it didn't matter. Because no matter how calm Marcus acted, Ethan knew he would come. And when he did, Ethan would be waiting with an army. Marcus didn't hesitate. The moment he read the note, he knew exactly what Ethan was trying to do. The challenge wasn't about proving strength or settling anything, it was about setting a trap. A last, desperate attempt for Ethan to regain control of a world that was slipping through his fingers. And yet, Marcus didn't crumple the note. Didn't toss it away or laugh it off. Instead, he calmly refolded it, tucked it into his pocket, and went back to his lunch like nothing had happened. By the time the final bell rang, the whole school knew about the challenge. Hallways buzzed with speculation. Did he say yes? I mean, he has to, right? No way he's dumb enough to show up alone. But then someone from Marcus's last class confirmed it. Yeah, I heard him tell Mr. Reynolds he might be late to the library after school. Said he had something to take care of. That was all it took. The message spread like wildfire. Marcus was going. Ethan smirked when he heard. Good. That meant he had won before the fight had even started. Marcus didn't know what he was walking into. Or at least, that's what Ethan thought. Because Marcus hadn't hesitated. Not because he didn't know what was coming, but because he did. The air was thick with anticipation as the final school bell rang. Students streamed out of the building, but not all of them were heading home. A quiet, knowing current moved through the crowd. Those who had heard about the challenge were already making their way behind the school. The spot was perfect. Nestled behind the old gym, past the empty football field, the back of the school was a wide-open patch of cracked pavement, bordered by a row of trees. It was far enough away that no teacher would casually stumble upon it, but still close enough for word to spread fast. Ethan and his crew were already there, waiting. Jason King, Derek Lane, Zach Torres, 3 of the toughest guys in school, stood beside him, stretching their shoulders, shaking out their fists, getting ready. Ethan paced slightly, rolling his shoulders. He had played this moment over and over in his head, imagining how it would go down. Marcus would show up, realize he was outnumbered, maybe try to back out. Ethan would give him a smirk, a choice, fight or run. And when Marcus fought, he'd lose. Not because he wasn't strong, but because no one could take on this many guys alone. At least, that's what Ethan believed. The crowd had started gathering, forming a loose circle around them. Nobody cheered. Nobody spoke. They all knew how this worked. No teachers. No interruptions. No one would step in once things started. And then, from the edge of the trees, Marcus appeared. He didn't slouch, didn't look nervous. He walked with the same steady, controlled confidence as always, his hands tucked into his pockets, his eyes calm. He took one look at the scene in front of him, the crowd, the fighters, Ethan's smug expression, and exhaled. Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward into the ring of students and stopped. Ethan grinned, stepping up to meet him. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked, voice dripping with amusement. Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "You're the one who needed backup," he said. The crowd murmured. Ethan's grin twitched. Marcus set his backpack down on the pavement, slow and deliberate. Then he rolled his shoulders, flexed his fingers. And just like that, the fight was on. The moment Marcus set his backpack down, Ethan's team moved into position. Jason cracked his knuckles, rolling his broad shoulders. Derek bounced on the balls of his feet, already itching to strike. Zach stood still, arms crossed, his dark eyes locked onto Marcus with quiet amusement. Ethan smirked as they circled Marcus, tightening the noose around him. From the outside, it looked like a done deal. 4 against 1. No weapons, no tricks, just brute force. Marcus had no chance. At least, that's what they believed. The crowd murmured in anticipation. The students who had followed Ethan here expected a quick, brutal beatdown. Some of them looked uncomfortable, unsure if this had gone too far. But no one stepped forward to stop it. Marcus, however, didn't move. He didn't shift into a defensive stance. Didn't show any fear. He just stood there, watching them. That stillness made Ethan's fingers twitch. It wasn't right. Marcus should have been nervous. He should have been looking for a way out. Instead, he looked patient. Ethan shook the thought away. It didn't matter. "All right, Johnson," he sneered, taking a slow step forward. "Last chance to walk away." Marcus met his eyes. "I thought this was what you wanted," he said calmly. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Jason huffed, impatient. "Enough talking." Derek smirked. "Let's get this over with." Ethan gave a sharp nod. "Take him." Derek lunged first. And in that instant, Marcus moved. Derek charged first, his fists swinging with raw power. He had been in fights before, on the football field, in parking lots, anywhere he needed to prove he was the toughest guy around. He expected Marcus to stumble, to flinch, to do what everyone else did when they saw him coming. But Marcus wasn't everyone else. With precise footwork, Marcus sidestepped just enough to avoid the first punch. Before Derek could react, Marcus pivoted and drove an open palm into his shoulder, redirecting his momentum, sending him stumbling forward past his target. Derek barely had time to recover before Marcus turned, grabbed his wrist, and twisted. In an instant, Derek's body followed the force, his feet leaving the ground. He hit the pavement with a hard thud, groaning as pain shot up his arm. The crowd gasped. Jason, the wrestling captain, wasn't about to wait his turn. He lunged, aiming to use his size and grappling skills to bring Marcus down. But Marcus was faster. As Jason reached out to grab him, Marcus ducked, sweeping Jason's leg out from under him. With no footing, Jason's own weight worked against him, sending him crashing onto his back. Zach finally moved. He wasn't like the others, he didn't charge in blind. He circled Marcus, looking for an opening. Marcus let him. The two moved in a slow, measured rhythm, Zach throwing calculated strikes, Marcus blocking, deflecting, waiting. Then, in a flash, Marcus struck. A precise elbow to Zach's ribs stole his breath. Before he could recover, Marcus followed with a sharp, controlled kick to his knee, forcing Zach to buckle. The fight should have been over then. But Ethan couldn't accept that. He rushed forward in desperation, swinging wildly. Marcus didn't dodge this time. Instead, he stepped in close, catching Ethan's wrist mid-swing. With a simple, effortless motion, he turned, twisted Ethan's arm behind his back, and forced him down to his knees. The schoolyard was dead silent. One by one, Ethan's fighters lay groaning on the ground. And Marcus? He hadn't even broken a sweat. Jason groaned as he pushed himself up from the pavement, his head spinning from the impact. Derek was still clutching his arm, Zach was breathing heavily, and Ethan was on his knees, locked in Marcus's grasp, humiliated in front of everyone. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Jason's pride stung more than his bruises. He had been so sure, so confident that Marcus was nothing more than an arrogant outsider who needed to be put in his place. But now, as he watched Marcus standing there, calm and unshaken, a sinking realization settled in. He had been used. Derek shook his head, frustration flickering in his eyes. This doesn't make sense. How the hell did this happen? Zach, usually the quietest of the group, exhaled sharply. Because we got played. Derek's brows furrowed. Jason looked over at Ethan, whose face was burning with humiliation. His fingers twitched as if he wanted to fight back, but there was nothing left to fight for. They had been told that Marcus had insulted their teams, that he had disrespected everything they worked for. But now, standing here in the aftermath, it was painfully clear Marcus had never been the enemy. Ethan had been the one pulling the strings. Jason clenched his fists, his anger shifting. You lied to us. His voice was low, dangerous. Ethan's eyes darted toward him, but he had no defense, no more words to twist the situation. Because in that moment, everyone knew the truth. And for the first time, Ethan had no one left on his side. The fight was over, and everyone knew it. Jason rubbed the back of his neck, his pride wounded more than his body. He wasn't used to losing, not like this, not in front of a crowd. With one last glance at Ethan, he turned and walked away, shaking his head. Derek struggled to his feet, wincing as he stretched his sore shoulder. He had come here expecting an easy beatdown, not a lesson in humility. Screw this, he muttered under his breath before limping off, pushing past the gawking students who had just watched him lose. Zach sat on the pavement for a moment, catching his breath. He wasn't angry, if anything, there was a strange hint of amusement in his eyes. He had fought a lot of people before, but none like Marcus. After a few beats, he exhaled, gave Marcus a slow nod, and walked off without a word. The others weren't so lucky. Some of Ethan's usual crew, Brandon, Cole, and Tyler, were still groaning on the ground, barely moving. A couple of them tried to push themselves up but collapsed again, their bruises and exhaustion keeping them down. And then there was Ethan. Still on his knees. Still stunned. The people he had trusted to help him take Marcus down were gone, retreating one by one, leaving him in the center of his own disaster. And for the first time in his life, he was completely alone. Ethan remained on his knees, his breaths coming in short, uneven bursts. The pain in his wrist from Marcus's hold was nothing compared to the crushing weight settling in his chest. He looked around, hoping, praying, for someone to still be standing beside him. But there was no one. Jason was gone. Derek had left without a word. Zach had walked away, not even bothering to look back. Even his usual crew, Brandon, Cole, Tyler, were either groaning on the ground or slipping away quietly, not wanting to be a part of this any longer. The crowd, once eager to see a fight, had shifted too. They weren't looking at him with admiration anymore. There was no respect left. No fear. Just pity. Ethan's fingers dug into the pavement as he clenched his jaw. How had it come to this? Just a few weeks ago, he had controlled everything: Westfield High, the hallways, the students. He was the one who decided who mattered and who didn't. But now, the world had flipped. Marcus, the kid he had picked as an easy target, stood calm and steady while Ethan was left kneeling, humiliated, powerless. And the worst part? No one was coming to help him. For the first time in his life, Ethan Walker was truly, completely alone. Ethan flinched as Marcus took a slow step forward. His instinct screamed at him to move, to get up, to fight back, but he couldn't. His body refused to obey. His pride was already shattered, his breath shaky, his hand still planted on the pavement where Marcus had left him. Marcus didn't rush. He didn't crack his knuckles or roll his shoulders like he was about to throw another punch. He didn't sneer or gloat the way Ethan would have if their positions were reversed. He just stood there, looking down at him. For Ethan, that was worse than any punch. Marcus should have been angry. He should have wanted revenge for everything Ethan had done to him, the insults, the bullying, the ambush. But instead, there was no hatred in his eyes. Just calm. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. The crowd was silent now, waiting for Marcus to finish it, to do what everyone expected him to do. But Marcus didn't move to hurt him. Instead, he simply tilted his head slightly, as if studying him, as if seeing him for the first time. And then, after a moment that stretched far too long, Marcus exhaled. And he turned away. He was done. Ethan had already lost. There was no need for anything more. Ethan sat there, frozen, watching Marcus walk away. For so long, he had convinced himself that Marcus was scared to fight back, scared to stand up, scared of him. That's why he had picked him as the target in the first place. Quiet kids were easy. They avoided trouble. They didn't fight back. But now, kneeling on the pavement, his body aching, Ethan saw the truth. Marcus had never been afraid. Not when he walked into the school for the first time and ignored the stares. Not when Ethan's group shoved him, insulted him, tried to break him down piece by piece. Not even when Ethan had gathered the biggest guys in school to take him down. Marcus had never been afraid because he had never seen Ethan as a threat. Ethan clenched his fists, his breath shaky. He had spent years controlling people through fear. That's how he kept his power, how he made sure no one ever challenged him. But Marcus had looked right through it, as if Ethan's power had never existed in the first place. And that's what made this worse than any fight. Ethan hadn't just lost in front of everyone. He had lost to someone who never even considered him a real opponent. That realization hit harder than any punch ever could. The next morning, something felt different at Westfield High. The usual tension that lingered in the hallways, the quiet fear that came from knowing who was in charge, it was gone. Ethan Walker wasn't strutting through the halls with his usual cocky grin. His crew wasn't shoving kids into lockers, making sarcastic comments, or reminding everyone who ran the school. Instead, they walked with their heads down, avoiding eye contact. Some of them didn't even show up to school at all. And with that, the invisible weight pressing on the school lifted. For the first time in years, students weren't constantly watching their backs. The younger kids, the ones who had spent their time carefully avoiding Ethan's group, walked a little taller. Conversations at lunch were louder, filled with laughter instead of hushed whispers about who had been targeted that day. No one said it outright, but everyone knew things had changed. People who had once stayed silent when they saw bullying now stepped in. Not because they were trying to be heroes, but because there was no longer the fear of retaliation. The school no longer revolved around Ethan's mood, his approval, or his unspoken rules. And Marcus? He didn't take Ethan's place. He didn't start walking around like he was in charge. He simply went on with his life, just as he had before. But even though Marcus didn't see himself as a leader, the school had begun to follow his example. Strength wasn't about control. It was about knowing when not to fight. and Westfield High had finally learned that lesson. At first, Ethan's former friends tried to act like nothing had changed. Brandon, Cole, and Tyler still walked the halls together, still sat at their usual table in the cafeteria, still tried to laugh like they were in on some joke no one else understood. But it wasn't the same. The rest of the school had moved on. The power they once had, the ability to make people nervous with just a look, to get away with whatever they wanted, was gone. And people noticed. Brandon tried to make a sarcastic comment in class one day, expecting the usual laughs. But instead, the room stayed quiet, the other students exchanging glances before ignoring him entirely. Cole, once one of the loudest voices in the hallways, found that no one really listened anymore. The people who used to follow him around were now sitting with different crowds, laughing at different jokes. Even Tyler, the most aggressive of the group, lost his edge. Without Ethan leading the charge, his tough guy act fell flat. The intimidation no longer worked. People weren't afraid of him anymore. They had built their entire identity on being part of Ethan's circle. Now, that circle was broken. No one said it out loud, but the message was clear. Westfield High had no place for them anymore. One by one, they drifted apart, their group shrinking until they were nothing more than faces in the crowd. They had spent years making people feel small. Now, they were the ones who had disappeared. Marcus could feel the shift in the school, but he didn't change with it. People looked at him differently now, not with pity or indifference, but with curiosity, maybe even quiet respect. Students who had once ignored him now gave him nods in the hallway. Some tried to strike up conversations, lingering near his locker or in the cafeteria, waiting for him to acknowledge them. But Marcus wasn't interested in any of that. He didn't start sitting at the most popular lunch tables. He didn't bask in the attention or let himself get swept up in the new social order that had formed after Ethan's fall. He simply continued living his life, just as he had before. When someone asked him about the fight, he would shrug. "It's over," was all he ever said. He still spent time in the library after school, reading quietly in the same spot he had always sat. He still walked home alone, taking the long route, enjoying the silence. And when a freshman nervously approached him one afternoon, hesitating before asking, "Hey, is it true you beat up all those guys?" Marcus just smiled slightly and said, "Does it matter?" The truth was, Marcus had never fought for power, respect, or control. He had only ever fought to protect himself. And now that the fight was over, he was perfectly happy going back to being just Marcus. A week had passed since the fight, but for Ethan, it felt like a lifetime. He no longer walked the halls like he owned them. Instead, he kept his head down, avoiding the stares and whispers that followed him wherever he went. The fear he had once commanded was gone, and in its place was something worse, indifference. People didn't fear him anymore. They didn't respect him. They just didn't care. His old crew had scattered. Jason, Derek, and Zach wanted nothing to do with him. Brandon and Cole barely spoke to him anymore. Even Tyler, his most loyal follower, had started eating lunch at a different table. Ethan had never felt this alone before. And so, without fully knowing why, he found himself walking behind the school, the place where it had all fallen apart. The air was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the pavement. And there, sitting on the same bench as always, was Marcus. Ethan hesitated. He hadn't planned what he was going to say. He didn't know what he wanted. But for some reason, he kept walking. Marcus didn't look up when Ethan approached. He was reading, calm as always, as if nothing had ever happened. Ethan stood there for a long moment, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Finally, Marcus turned a page in his book and spoke without looking at him. "Took you long enough." Ethan swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what he had expected from Marcus. But it definitely wasn't that. Ethan stood there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His throat was dry, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He had never struggled to speak before, his words had always come easily, effortlessly. But now, standing in front of Marcus, nothing felt easy. Marcus didn't rush him. He just sat there, book open in his hands, waiting. Finally, Ethan exhaled sharply and dropped onto the bench beside him, staring at the pavement. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The words were right there, sitting in Ethan's chest like a heavy weight. He knew what he had to say. But admitting it? Saying it out loud? That was harder than any fight he had ever been in. Finally, after what felt like forever, he forced himself to speak. I was wrong. The words felt strange coming from his mouth, like they didn't belong to him. But the moment they were out, a weight lifted from his shoulders. Marcus finally looked at him then, his expression unreadable. Ethan swallowed hard and continued. I was wrong about everything. About you. About all of it. He rubbed a hand over his face, frustrated with himself. I thought being strong meant controlling people, making them afraid. But you, he let out a short, bitter laugh. You didn't play by those rules. And I hated that. Marcus studied him for a moment, then simply nodded. Ethan had expected a lecture, some speech about how he deserved everything that had happened. But Marcus didn't say anything. Because he already knew. Ethan had finally figured it out for himself. Ethan waited for Marcus to say something, anything. A smirk. A taunt. Some reminder that Ethan had lost, that he had been humiliated in front of the entire school. But Marcus didn't do any of that. He didn't gloat. He didn't even look surprised. Instead, he just nodded, as if he had expected Ethan to come to this realization all along. For some reason, that made Ethan feel even smaller. If Marcus had mocked him, if he had rubbed it in, that would have been easier. That would have given Ethan something to push back against, a reason to hold on to his pride. But there was nothing to push back against. Marcus simply turned another page in his book, not acting like this moment was anything bigger than what it was, a conversation. After a long silence, Marcus finally spoke. Yeah, he said simply. You were. That was it. No lecture. No self-righteous speech. Just a calm acknowledgement of the truth. And somehow, that hit harder than anything else. Ethan swallowed and glanced down at his hands. He had spent years building himself up as the strongest person at Westfield High, the one who dictated how things worked. But now he understood. Marcus had always been stronger. Not because he was the best fighter. Not because he could take people down without breaking a sweat. But because he didn't need to prove it. Ethan let out a slow breath. For the first time, he was starting to understand what real strength looked like. Ethan sat there for a few more moments, staring at the cracks in the pavement. He had come here expecting something, he wasn't sure what. Maybe a confrontation, maybe a moment where Marcus finally put him in his place. But instead, he had gotten this. A quiet conversation. A simple acknowledgement. No hatred, no grudges, no victory laps. And somehow, that was worse. Marcus wasn't his enemy. He never had been. Ethan had spent so much time trying to prove his strength, to hold on to his control over the school, that he had never stopped to ask himself why. Now, sitting beside Marcus, someone who had every reason to hate him but didn't, he realized just how tired he was. Tired of pretending. Tired of trying to hold on to something that had never really mattered. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt something unfamiliar. Relief. He exhaled and stood up, his movements slower, less tense than before. His hands weren't clenched into fists. His shoulders weren't hunched forward in frustration. He looked at Marcus one last time, searching for anything else he needed to say. But there was nothing left. Instead, he just nodded. Marcus nodded back. And with that, Ethan turned and walked away. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time, it didn't feel like he had to prove anything when he got there. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. Marcus had never needed to throw the first punch. That was what set him apart. From the very beginning, he had been tested, pushed, provoked, insulted. Ethan and his crew had tried everything to get a reaction out of him, to make him crack. But he never did. Not because he was weak, but because he was in control. Marcus understood something Ethan never had. True strength isn't about overpowering others. It's about controlling yourself. He could have fought back at any time. He could have put Ethan in his place long before things escalated. But he chose not to. He didn't let anger dictate his actions. He didn't fight because he was insecure or desperate to prove something. When he finally defended himself, it wasn't out of rage. It was out of necessity. And even then, he didn't destroy Ethan, he simply ended the fight. And that's why, in the end, Marcus won something much bigger than a schoolyard brawl. He won respect. Not just from the students, not just from the ones who had once doubted him, but even from Ethan himself. Because real strength isn't about control over others. It's about control over yourself. And Marcus had more of that than anyone Ethan had ever met. As Ethan walked away from Marcus that day, something finally clicked. For years, he had believed that respect came from control. That fear and power were the same thing. That if people were too afraid to challenge him, they would respect him. But that wasn't respect. That was obedience. And obedience was temporary. It disappeared the moment fear lost its grip. That's why, after his fall, no one stood by him. No one defended him, no one tried to help him back up. Because the moment his power faded, so did the illusion that he had ever been respected in the first place. Marcus, on the other hand, had done nothing to demand respect. He hadn't forced anyone to follow him. He hadn't needed a group, a reputation, or fear to keep people in line. Yet now, when Marcus walked through the halls, people looked at him differently. Not because they were scared of him, but because they respected him. Not because he had won a fight, but because he had never needed to fight to prove who he was. Ethan finally understood the difference. Fear fades. Control slips away. But real respect? That's earned. And for the first time in his life, Ethan realized he had never really had it. Westfield High would never be the same again. For years, the school had followed an unspoken set of rules. Ethan had been in charge, and his influence shaped everything, the way people acted, who they could talk to, who they had to avoid. But now, those rules were gone. Not because Marcus had taken Ethan's place, but because no one needed a ruler anymore. After what happened, students started to realize they didn't have to walk on eggshells, afraid of stepping out of line. They weren't bound by the old social order Ethan had built. They were free. For the first time, people spoke up when they saw someone being picked on. They no longer laughed nervously at cruel jokes just to stay on Ethan's good side. The change wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't happen overnight. But it was real. It was in the way a freshman felt safe sitting wherever he wanted at lunch. In the way students helped each other without worrying about how it looked. In the way fear no longer controlled the school. And all because one person had refused to be broken. Marcus didn't set out to change Westfield High. But by standing his ground, by proving that real strength was about self-control, he had done just that. And the school was better for it. Marcus never asked for any of this. He hadn't come to Westfield High looking for a fight. He hadn't wanted to change the way things worked. All he ever wanted was to live his life quietly, to go to school, to go home, and to be left alone. And now, after everything, that's exactly what he did. The whispers about him faded over time. Eventually, the story of how he had taken down Ethan and his crew became just another school legend, something freshmen heard about but never fully understood. But Marcus? He stayed the same. He still sat at the same table in the cafeteria, reading a book while the world buzzed around him. He still walked the same route home, taking his time, enjoying the quiet. People respected him now, but that didn't change who he was. He had never fought for attention or approval, and he wasn't about to start now. One afternoon, as he left school, a younger student called out to him. "Hey, Marcus?" He turned, raising an eyebrow. The kid hesitated. "How'd you learn to fight like that?" Marcus considered the question for a moment before offering a small, knowing smile. "It's not about fighting," he said simply. "It's about knowing when not to." And with that, he kept walking, peaceful, steady, unchanged. Just Marcus. Strength is not about force, it is about control. In life, many people mistake power for dominance, believing that respect comes from making others fear them. But true strength is not about intimidation or proving yourself to others. It is about self-discipline, patience, and knowing when to act and when to walk away. Marcus showed that real power comes from within. He was tested, provoked, and pushed to his limits, yet he did not let anger or pride dictate his actions. He only fought when he had to, not because he wanted to. In doing so, he earned something far greater than victory. He earned respect. This lesson applies to everyday life, especially as we grow older. There will always be those who seek control, those who use force to mask their own insecurities. But wisdom teaches us that the strongest person is not the loudest in the room, nor the one who wins every argument. The strongest person is the one who knows their worth without needing to prove it. The world may not always be fair, but inner strength allows us to face challenges with dignity. And sometimes, the greatest act of strength is simply walking away with your head held high.